Welcome everybody to Go Local Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. It is another remarkably beautiful fall day here in Rhode Island. It's supposed to hit close to 80 degrees today, but we head down to the University of Virginia. Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department, she joins us this morning. Professor, thanks so much.
Sure.
Okay, it's the short strokes. Here it is. We've been waiting for months and months and months. Where are we in this presidential race? Let me ask the most basic question. Who's got momentum?
I don't know. I mean, this campaign has been unlike any campaign I've ever seen, in that from the minute Kamala Harris got into the race and closed the gap that had been created when Biden was the candidate, the polls have pretty much held steady. Both sides have done everything they possibly can to energize their base pretty successfully. There are very few undecided voters, and both campaigns are barnstorming the country. So we've been tied for about 3 months. We're still tied right now, and it's going to come down to Tuesday and who actually shows up.
So I believe yesterday there was an opinion piece in the New York Times by a Republican and a Democratic pollster jointly authoring it, and it broke down a number of really remarkable differences between this race. One of them was the gender gap, especially amongst college-educated women versus non-college-educated men. That gap is at its biggest level, even bigger than Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. It's at 43%. I mean, it just seems so amazing, like literally two different worlds. What does that say about us, and what does it say about next Tuesday?
Well, the first thing I would say is a lot of pollsters and pundits and journalists have taken liberties with how they've calculated the gender gap over time. It's not actually that big. When we calculate the gender gap, it's the difference in support between men and women for a given candidate, not the absolute difference between both. But it's still huge, and it is bigger than 2016. In every presidential election since 1980, women have been more likely than men to support the Democrat. But these margins, I think, highlight that a lot of issues that are disproportionately important to women are on the ballot and are reflected in the differences in these candidates. Reproductive rights is key among them. And the other reason that we're seeing such a big gap is because while the Democrats are really doing everything they can to convince and motivate and mobilize suburban women and young women, the Trump campaign is really making an explicit play for young men. And that's something that we haven't seen that frequently. So both sides are trying to pull at different parts of the electorate, and it looks like they're succeeding.
So Nikki Haley obviously has been out a couple times criticizing the sort of bromance messaging of the Trump Trump campaign in trying to attract young men and explicitly somewhat alienate women. Is she right, and is that going to be his potential downfall?
Look, she's probably right, but that ship sailed when Donald Trump made J.D. Vance vice president. I mean, actually, that ship sailed when Donald Trump became the nominee in 2016. But the reality is that the Trump campaign has engaged in a strategy where, rather than trying to appeal to suburban women like previous Republican candidates have, they've decided that they can hit their win number by trying to mobilize men. And they think the way to do that is to emphasize this bro kind of culture, this protectionism that Donald Trump and other men will provide to women. The Lincoln Project has this crazy ad out. It looks like it's right out of The Handmaid's Tale. It's men going with their wives to vote, and the wives tell the men that, of course, they're going to vote for Donald Trump, and then they make eye contact with each other and vote for Kamala Harris secretly. That's not the country we live in, but that's the country that the Trump campaign is trying to create. And I think that's appealing to a decent portion of men out there.
Joe Biden, after Donald Trump had a disastrous Madison Square Garden event raising concerns about racism and anti-Latino comments, Joe Biden came out of his little cave and stuck his foot directly in his mouth. One, how much damage was done? And two, why hasn't the Harris campaign told President Biden that the country is under threat and stick him in that security tunnel somewhere in West Virginia that we don't know about in case there's a nuclear attack?
Well, first, it all comes down to the placement of an apostrophe, right?
Yeah, sure. Let me wag my finger at you. Is this the new Bill Clinton-ism?
the definition of what is.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think so. There are a couple of pieces of information here that are less damning for Harris than would otherwise be the case. The first is that Joe Biden is not on the ticket, whereas the things that Donald Trump has said have come directly out of his mouth. Second, Harris very quickly not only distanced herself from the comments, but said explicitly that she does not feel this way. And, first thing on the tarmac yesterday morning, she said that she doesn't believe that she would be a president for any one segment of society. She should be a president for all of America. She would never describe voters on either side of the aisle that way. And she doesn't think about voters based on the candidate for whom they're ultimately going to choose. So I think she was as hard hitting and as direct as she could be. As far as not using Joe Biden on the campaign trail, the campaign isn't. And high-profile Democratic operatives, were stunned and shocked and upset. It's also a little bit unclear why he was doing this virtual messaging at the same time that she was giving her speech. But the reality is that it's 5 more days. There certainly are not going to be any big events, including Joe Biden. And I think what the Harris campaign is hoping is that people realize that he misspeaks all the time. This is another gaffe. She called him on it, and she didn't say it.
I think they should tell him to either return to the basement in Delaware or into the secure cave somewhere in West Virginia.
I do think it's tricky, though, because he is the president of the United States. So, I think that this has probably been very, very difficult for him to begin with. I don't think he has that many opportunities to express his views about the campaign or Donald Trump. And I think he probably didn't realize the damage that he was doing.
Yeah, it was not a winning strategy for Biden. In the last 5 days, will the media allow anything to change the narrative? Sort of the golden rule has been, in the final weekend, really starting sort of Friday night through the weekend into Tuesday, unless there's something catastrophic that happens, the press really steps back and says, okay, we're not going to allow anybody to dump something out there. They've had years to dump the information. It doesn't get the opportunity to get vetted correctly. It doesn't get the opportunity to have responses. Or will the media bite on something that they think is juicy?
I don't know that it's a matter of biting on something that's juicy anymore, because right now, what the media do are cover the actual events, right? There was a woman that just came out and said that Donald Trump had assaulted her. I think that's not going to get vetted or get the kind of attention that it ordinarily would if it was a couple of months ago. But, covering a big rally like the rally at Madison Square Garden last weekend, if Donald Trump has a huge event over the course of the next 5 days and there are explicitly racist statements coming out of them, of course they're going to get covered. And of course that becomes a story. And of course that feeds into the Democrats' argument that Donald Trump is not suited to be president and that this should be disqualifying. So I do think that there will be hard-hitting coverage between now and Tuesday, but it's likely going to be directly coming from live coverage of the campaigns and seeing what the candidates themselves are saying. I don't think there will be big investigative journalism pieces that are released between now and then. But frankly, how many big investigative journalism pieces have been released this entire cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. Going into election day and reporting, talk about that. I know we're not going to know the final numbers in certain states for maybe as many as a couple days, all the way into as late as Friday, and could even go into the following week, depending on the situations and the legal obstacles accordingly. But the big blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, will we have a sense on Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning, where those 3 states figure?
It's likely that we will know who wins Michigan and Wisconsin. Pennsylvania is trickier because they're not allowed to start even opening the ballots until the polls close. And so that is very, very complicated, especially because we're talking about millions of votes that have come in and signatures need to be matched, et cetera, et cetera. That said, we do know the percentage of people, that voted early versus voted in person. We're also going to know what the vote share is for the in-person vote, and the counties where Donald Trump or Kamala Harris are overperforming or underperforming in 2020. And so it's likely that if there's going to be a decisive winner in Pennsylvania, I don't know if the networks will call it, but we'll have a pretty decent sense.
And then I believe last night a key Trump campaign ally tweeted that early voting, while no one knows if they voted for Trump or Harris, hit the sort of panic button that the number of early voting women is an indication that Harris has tremendous momentum and that men need to go out there and vote. Really a call to action of men against this, what he perceived as a flood of early voting in key states by women. Any analysis of that? Is that a mixed signal, or is that a real signal from the Trump campaign?
Well, two things I would say are, first, apparently a partisan war is not enough for the Trump campaign. Now they're actually explicitly engaged in a war of the sexes, which is disgusting. Second, in terms of what this is actually going to tell us, we don't have to only look at early voting this cycle. We can look at the 2022 midterms, and we can look at the special elections post-Dobbs. It was women who were voting, including in red states, who actually wound up giving Democrats an advantage. So if I were a Republican and the gender divide among the early voters was significant, I too would be worried. But the other thing to keep in mind here is that women do outnumber men, not only among registered voters, but among actual voters. So some of this can't be assessed based just on the raw numbers. You've got to look at the proportions, and we don't know what overall voter turnout is going to be yet, so it's hard to tell.
Billie Jean King beat Bobby Riggs by a wide margin at the Houston Astrodome back in the 70s. Is that the precursor to this election?
Colin Allred hopes so.
Okay, it is prediction time. There's no hiding now. We've sort of tried to nail you down a few times. Who is going to be the next president of the United States?
Kamala Harris.
And why?
First, as I've been saying for months now, the ground game among the Democrats seems like a well-oiled machine, and the ground game for the Republicans has been farmed out and seems pretty fragmented. And in a turnout election, you don't want there to be any unknowns or any uncertainty. Second, the candidates are neck and neck in the polls, but pollsters are telling us throughout the country, first, that it's obviously difficult to poll presidential elections, but second, that a lot of the likely voter screens and a lot of the assessments of what the electorate is going to look like still are based in part on Joe Biden being the nominee, because we just haven't had that much time to figure out how inspiring, how enthusiastic Kamala Harris has been. So I think her levels of support might be underreported. And then third, it's going to be a close election in these battleground states, but Harris has engaged in a two-pronged strategy where she's not only doing everything she possibly can to get out her voters, but she's also trying to woo that final 1 or 2%. And in some places, we're talking about 200, 300, 400 voters. The Trump campaign has a one-pronged strategy, which is to double down and make sure that it gets out its base. And so I generally think that it's more effective to throw multiple things at the wall.
Okay. What should we be looking for on Tuesday? Early indications of a victor, one way or the other?
If Kamala Harris does well in North Carolina closes pretty early and they count pretty quickly. If she is somehow able to pull off a victory in North Carolina, which was the trickiest swing state for her, that obviously bodes very well. If Trump wins North Carolina, I don't think there's anything we can necessarily draw from that. The other thing that I would note that's going to be important is in Florida and in New York, if the congressional districts that are purple districts with high Puerto Rican populations actually flip and Democrats get elected, that I think tells us that the Puerto Rican vote and voters were mobilized, and that could bode very well for Harris in a state like Pennsylvania.
Besides Pennsylvania, which has an arcane voting counting structure, are there any of the other swing states that are going to be sort of de facto long counts?
Yes, so Arizona is probably going to take the longest. Officials from Maricopa County, which includes something like, 40% of the population in Arizona, on average, it takes them 13 days to count all the votes. And so if it ultimately comes down to Arizona, this could be a Christmas surprise.
God, that'll do wonders for the country. I can only imagine. With that, as always, thank you, and hopefully we'll see you right after election night, hopefully on Wednesday, to get some insights. For everybody else, enjoy this great weather. Happy Halloween, and great news out of the World Series. Mookie Betts, former Boston Red Sox, helped lead the LA Dodgers over the evil empire, the New York Yankees. So there is some good news for America today. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.